This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
This morning on Saturday Breakfast, we are talking about John Milton's Of Education and how no matter how much we complain, no matter how much we talk, some things in education just never change.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
A very good morning to you. It is Saturday the 19th of July 2025. It is 9:02 here in the UK, and this is your Teachers Talk Radio Saturday breakfast show with me, your host Darren Lester. How has your week been? We like to start Saturday breakfast by asking that question. Well, it's been good. Mine has been once again very busy, which is always a positive. I had a couple of days of conferences right at the beginning of the week, one about different research methods and, how we can kind of really make sure that our research is vigorous and is, I didn't mean vigorous, I meant rigorous, but vigorous also works, to be honest. We like a bit of vigor in our research, how we can make sure our research is rigorous and vigorous and really stands up to scrutiny. And I've been thinking a lot this week, kind of off the back of that, about research and about talking and about the conversations that we have within education and how they kind of seem to go nowhere, which is really the point of today's show. That's kind of not explicitly what we're going to be talking about, but it is kind of the point of today and what I want to kind of uncover. Things are all kind of tying together quite nicely, as they do every so often, because this also ties into a point that Tom made on LinkedIn. Either this week or last, I will be very honest, I don't remember. We're in kind of summer mode where all of the days kind of blend together, which, not going to lie, I quite like. I do quite like when I don't know what day of the week it is. But Tom said that it's all very well and good talking to teachers about research, getting them to understand the latest research, but when we are still kind of battling with behavior, when we are still battling with just getting bums in seats and getting the kids to engage with what's going on, that's the last thing that we should be thinking about, because we need to be facing the immediate issues that we have. I hope that I've summarized that correctly. Tom, if I've got that wrong, you can correct me. I'm more than happy for that to be done. But my reply to it was, yeah, that's all very well and good saying that, but it kind of is the crux of the problem, because as teachers, we should be the ones engaging with the research. We should be the ones driving that change. We should be the ones making that change, and we are prevented from doing so because of the other issues that we face. And I think we were making the same point, but coming at it from a couple of different ways, as is often the case when educators talk about research. Because the way that I interpreted what Tom was saying was that as teachers, first and foremost, we need to be equipped to deal with these behavioral issues, and all of the other problems that we are dealing with before we can then engage with the research. Whereas my very firm belief is that actually schools need more funding to employ other people to deal with the behavioral issues and the pastoral issues and all of that sort of stuff, so that teachers can be focused on teaching. I don't think that either of our points of view are actually going to happen, because things don't change. Things really don't change. The third thing that kind of tipped me off that this was the right topic for today was actually something that I read in the paper this morning. Now, I am well aware that I am buying into that psychological thing. The name escapes me, but you know, where you think about something and then suddenly you see it everywhere. I'm well aware that I'm buying into that today, but I'm choosing to believe that it's the universe giving me signs that I am supposed to be talking about John Milton. Because when I kind of did my early morning doom scrolling this morning, I came across this newspaper article from the BBC, which is headlined "East London School Dating Back to 1500s to Close." And it's about St Mary's C.A.V. Primary School, which is in... You can tell that I've literally just read this morning, because I actually don't have any notes on it. I've just got the the article open in front of me. It's in Stoke Newington. Opened in 1563, so during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Has been continuously open since then, I believe. It has moved premises at least once, maybe twice, in that time. But it has been open. It has been serving that community for 462 years, and it's now closing because of falling pupil numbers. So it's a primary school, and primary schools are particularly susceptible to being shut down due to falling numbers. And it has, I believe, something... There we go. The head, in an interview with the BBC, said, "We started the year on about 70 pupils. She said, deep down, I knew I couldn't manage another year with the budgets and paying the wages, so for me, it was inevitable." Now, there's a lot to unpack in that one statement, I think. But for me, the key things that stand out are that 70 pupils, 70 individual people, is quite a lot of people. Those are quite a few pupils. I mean, yes, it's 10 if they're going... I actually don't know which year groups they served, but if they were going reception to year 6, that's 10 pupils per year group. So if you look at it like that, where, a single form entry school might have 30 odd, a dual form entry school might have 60 odd, 10 in a year group is not very many. But 70 individual people is quite a lot. I wouldn't fit 70 people in the room that I'm sitting in right now, for example. So, sometimes I think the way that we frame pupil numbers is wrong, because we talk about them as this kind of homogenous grouping. We just talk about X number of pupils, and we tend to forget how many individual people that actually is. But the thing that really jumped out to me was how the head mentioned dealing with the budgets and paying the wages. I couldn't do that. I could not be in charge of payroll and budgeting for an entire school. So absolutely, my hat's off to those who do, to the head teachers, to the bursars, to the finance committees, to everybody who is in charge of dealing with the money, because that's just... my brain just does not work in that way. I couldn't do it. But I thought, how sad that was kind of what it had to come down to. That this head teacher, Brenda McKelvey, who's been at the school since 2010, So, she's been there for a very long time. She served as the deputy head there for a very long time. She's been head for the past 2 years. So, her career is really ingrained within this school. And everything, like the whole culmination of her time there, has come down to money, has come down to a budget, has come down to whether she can afford to pay her staff. And ultimately, the decision, clearly not her decision. A head doesn't unilaterally have the power to open or close a school. There are committees, there are local authorities, there are all sorts of people who are behind that decision. But ultimately, that decision came down to money. And relocating 70 pupils is not the end of the world, particularly when a bunch of them will have been year sixes, so they will be moving on anyway. And that may have been kind of what tipped the scales. If the incoming reception class or the incoming year 3 class, whichever is the first year group in that school, if they weren't as big as the leaving year 6 class, and so they were down to even fewer than 70 pupils, that may have been what tipped the scales. But I couldn't help but think about how sad that was. That 462 years of continuous education, an institution, realistically, in terms of English schooling, all comes to a close because of money. And I thought, I wonder how many other historical institutions, historical schools, we may have lost due to financial issues. And I wonder how many we are in danger of losing due to financial issues. So many of our oldest schools are fee-paying schools, and we are seeing fee-paying schools closing down left, right, and centre because of the increase in VAT. And so I'm wondering, how much of our history, of our professional history, we are going to lose, all because education is being co-opted at the moment, and education is all about whether or not it is financially sustainable, whether or not it is financially viable. But I think one of the main issues that has come to light for me as a result of this, and I hadn't really thought about this until this morning, until I read this article, is the fact that as teachers, we don't particularly look at our own history, the history of our profession. We are very busy moving forward. Well, we're very busy treading water and trying to survive the day. But we're all about moving forward. We're all about innovating. We're all about doing what is best for the pupils that we have right now, which is, absolutely the right thing for us to be focused on. But we have so much to learn if we were to look backwards, and if we were to look at the people who came before us, not our immediate predecessors, but if we go back decades and even centuries, we can start to spot patterns. We can start to see where things have and haven't worked. It's that old adage of those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. But that's exactly what we're doing in education. We are repeating the same things. We are making the same mistakes. And I think, what is happening with St Mary's C.V. Primary School is a prime example of that. I'm just going to try and find it in the article because I think it's really interesting and I really want to make sure that I get it right. Not that bit, because I'm going to come back to that. I was reading about an inspection that they had. And this particular one that the BBC article talks about was an inspection that happened during World War II. And this is in the school records. And the record for the 26th of June, 1944 states, the school was visited after a night of continuous alert, and at 5 a.m. there was a severe incident 2 streets away. So this school that was still open up until the end of this academic year, had been opened since the 1600s, in 1944, was inspected by the equivalent of Ofsted back then, by the inspectorate, after a night of continuous air raid alerts and a severe incident, whatever that may have been, a dropped bomb or whatever it could have been, 2 streets away at 5 o'clock that morning, probably impacting the children who were in the class that was being inspected. And how many times do we read on teacher social media, oh, I can't believe that we are being inspected when it's the last week of the holiday, the last week of term. I can't believe we're being inspected when we've got broken pipes. I can't believe we're being inspected when the school kitchen is having to shut down. You know, we're still talking about the poor timing of inspections and how inspections will continue to go ahead even within the worst circumstances. And this is what people were talking about in June 1944. Nothing has changed. The other thing that I really like about this school, from what I've read in this article, is what was called the punishment book. So it's this handwritten book which dates 1931 to 1971, where behavior incidents, both are fine, were recorded. And you've got the names of the pupils. And interestingly, as the head points out, all boys, not a single girl's name is recorded in this book as being punished in all of those years, 1931 to 1971. So you've got the list of these boys and how they were punished, which is quite often one stroke to the back of the hand. So we are talking corporal punishment, and what they were punished for. And she says it's all for persistent lying, disobedience, not following school values, using a catapult, that's quite a good one, deliberately spoiling test papers. So it's, again, all still for things that we are talking about right now. It's all for this kind of what we might these days term low-level disruption. Things that may not be the end of the world, but are enough as a teacher to get on your nerves. And this is what the children were doing back in the 1930s, all the way through to the 1940s. We have conversations today about whether boys are disproportionately punished compared to girls. We can see that if we flick through this punishment book that covers 1931 to 1971, where not a single female pupil is listed. All of these conversations that we have are appearing to be cyclical. They keep coming round again and again and again. And we're not changing anything, despite the fact that we keep having these conversations. And I think the reasons that we don't change anything is because we don't look back at our own history, at the history of our profession. And one of the reasons that that is so difficult is because we are losing some of these places, like St. Mary's Church of England Primary School, just because it's no longer financially viable to keep them open. And so we as teachers are allowing 462 years of educational history to disappear just because of finances, which I think is really, really sad. Now, you know, living in the real world, we know that finances are important. You know, teachers have to make money in order to live. Our job is a job. It may be vocational, it may be professional, you know, we can throw all of the other terms at it that we like, but ultimately it is a job and we do it so that we can earn money, so that we can pay our rent, pay our mortgage, buy food, just the same as everybody else in employment. So, you know, I'm not saying that there is no monetary value to education, and I'm not saying that we need to live in this kind of flowers and rainbows world where money doesn't touch us, because that's a very dangerous path for us to go down, that then goes back to teachers shouldn't be paid as much as we are, which, let's be honest, is not very much to begin with. But what I am saying is that as teachers, we need to take an active interest in the history of our profession. We need to take an active interest in what has come before us, so that we can see exactly where the issues in teaching are embedded, how long they've been embedded for, where they have come from. Because it's when we can figure out how and why they're embedded that we can figure out how we can finally make the changes that our career ancestors, if you like, couldn't make themselves.
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Kapow Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to kapowprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week covers a government announcement that it will no longer fund academies to fight admissions appeals. The funding of £180 per appeal, which has been available for many years for academies which deal with more than 20 appeals in a year, will not cover those after the 31st of October, with final applications due in by January the 7th. The government said academies were funded on the same basis as maintained schools, and it was expected that the costs will be met from their overall budget. It is pointed out that maintained schools that were their own admissions authorities had to cover appeals from their own budgets. Confederation of Schools Trust Chief Executive Leora Cruddas said the reduction in funding was unwelcome, and this change will affect the most popular oversubscribed schools. One trust, commenting anonymously, said 2 of its schools received over 1,000 applications for just over 200 places at each, and that between them the schools hear between 120 and 150 Year 7 appeals, up to 25 Year 12 appeals, and around 30 in-year appeals each year. This costs around £20,000. The announcement has also been criticised for the short notice, which further harms budget planning. A Department for Education spokesperson said the grant was introduced in the infancy of the Academy's programme to support new academies subject to high numbers of appeals at that time. Critics of the move say it's another cost to bear from already stretched budgets. More detail and comment is on Schools Week online. The Standard reports on falling roll numbers that it says are expected to drop at a faster rate than previously projected over the next 5 years in primary and nursery schools. The report comes as primaries in parts of England, including London, have been considering closing due to falling numbers and funding pressures. The latest Department for Education projections suggest just over 4.2 million pupils will be in state nursery and primary schools by 2030, a fall of 300,000. Meanwhile, 3.1 million pupils are projected to be in state secondaries, 97,000 lower than in 2025. A population bulge has been moving into secondary schools, but the Department for Education now expects these numbers to peak in 2026 to 27. Numbers as rare the schools are funded, as it is currently based on a per-pupil approach. Paul Whiteman of the NAHT union said falling rolls can create a real headache for schools already struggling and encourages government to think again. Additional comment included in the article can be found on the Standard website. School holidays in the UK are either underway or about to begin, so the BBC has made a timely investigation into the costs of summer holiday clubs. The cost of living correspondent says the 6-week break can now cost parents an average of £1,076 per child. The article acknowledges that price varies by region, with research by children's charity Quorum saying some areas have hiked prices by 13%. The charity says high demand and a lack of cheaper council-run activities are driving up prices. Most families depend on some form of childcare for part of the school holidays, as an increasing number of households have 2 parents in full-time work, and it is now less common to live close to relatives. Data published in the article suggests Wales and the South East are the most expensive, with a respective average weekly cost of £210 and £196, with the North West the cheapest at £162. Childminder costs are also covered, with Inner London being the most expensive weekly cost of £306 and the South West the least expensive at £191. Those running clubs say rising costs mean prices have also had to increase to cover things like staffing and materials. Places on council-run schemes can be hard to find. There are fewer holiday club places for children over 7 and availability drops significantly for those over 11. Children with SEND of any age have even fewer options available, with just 9% of local authorities in England saying they had enough provision for 75% of children with SEND in their area. Full details and advice on how to save money on holiday clubs can be found online. Finally, the BBC also reports that some pupils in a Lancashire secondary school will be taught maths by a teacher based 300 miles away in Devon. The remote lessons will be for top set students in years 9 to 11, with a letter to parents describing it as an exciting initiative. The lessons with the exceptional virtual teacher will be supported by another qualified teacher experienced in maths. The National Education Union has responded by raising concerns that a teaching assistant would be used in the classroom, but the school clarified the second adult would be a qualified teacher who would provide learning, behavioural and pastoral support to pupils. Pupils will use a special laptop and headset to take part in the lessons. The school said this plan was a small-scale initiative used only in exceptional circumstances where recruitment challenges make it difficult to secure high-quality, subject-specific teaching. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Thank you, Joe. Always love hearing the news, always love hearing your roundup of what has happened during the week. You may be surprised that as somebody who teaches online these days, my school is an online school, I do have concerns about that final story that Joe reported on, about schools starting to use online teaching services. And the reason for that is that I fear schools will continue to be reduced to being babysitting services, particularly given what Joe was reporting on there as well about the cost of childcare, particularly during the holidays. I do have a concern that we will be, I don't know if anybody remembers this as an episode of The Simpsons. Other cartoons are available. And in this episode, there's a flash forward to the future where corporations run education and all of the children are sitting in a classroom being taught via a remote teacher on a TV screen, and then their regular teacher is kind of just sitting in the back. I think she's smoking, if I'm picturing the scene correctly, and is just kind of there again for behavior management reasons, while this one. I think it's even a maths lesson. This one maths teacher teaches every pupil in the country via video link. And it was presented as this like dystopian horror of what can happen if education becomes run by companies. But I do worry that that is exactly what's going to happen. That you end up literally only needing one teacher per subject for the country, and they sit in a TV studio and deliver their lessons, whilst others are paid to essentially babysit the children. And my concern there is kind of twofold. I understand that The Simpsons was being tongue in cheek and that it probably won't get that far. I don't think the unions will allow it to get that far. But it does make me concerned about the way that schools are perceived. Because it is, unfortunately, all about perception. It's all about optics. And we know that schools are perceived highly as being babysitting services these days. It has become cyclical. What Joe mentioned there about all the adults in a household working, both parents working, or the sole parent working in single parent families. It's necessary because of the way the world works now, but it's facilitated by the fact that schools are open from, let's say, 9 till 3:30 for the kids, and then there are also wraparound care provisions that are provided. It's facilitated by the fact that schools will offer revision sessions during the holiday. It's facilitated by the fact that there are these clubs, expensive though they may be, that are run and will quite often run out of schools. They will hire school premises to do so. And so it creates this idea that the school building, the school itself, the institution, is a childcare service that just happens to provide some education. And while I'm not sure that we will see it in my lifetime, I do have concerns that that's kind of where we are headed, that schools are childcare provision first and foremost, and the educational bit is just a bit of a bolt-on, just as long as the kids have got somewhere to go during the day. And I think we've got to rally against that. We've got to fight to preserve the fact that schools are and should be first and foremost educational institutions. There are lots of reasons. There are lots of societal reasons why they're not that first and foremost anymore. Cutbacks in public services mean that in order for us to do the best by our kids, we do need to make sure that we are able to provide them with breakfast, that we are able to provide them with wraparound care, that we have got extra uniform tucked away just in case they need it, just in case the parents can't afford it. There are all sorts of reasons why those kind of pastoral ideas are front and center now, and it's very, very important that they are, given the society in which we currently live. But again, when you look back at our history, I love how everything is tying together for the show today. When you look back at our history, it hasn't always been that way. My granddad, who would be in his late 80s, early 90s now, he used to tell stories about how infant school, so kind of, age 4, 5, 6 years old, he used to take to school with him a potato wrapped in tinfoil. And he would put it on the fire that was in his infant classroom when he got to school in the morning, and the potato would bake, and that would be what he had for lunch. And that was what everybody in his little class did. They all took their own potato with them, because this was the days before free school meals, which were implemented, which were brought in because schools, local authorities very quickly realized that not all children were getting a hot meal in the day. So the school stepped in to provide that. The school stepped in to kind of fill that gap. Not necessarily at the time because that was seen as being the school's role, but just because it kind of made sense, because the children were there at lunchtime anyway. So if the school could then provide a hot meal, at least the children were getting one. There was that opportunity to have one. And that kind of is the mentality that still exists today. That's why free school meals continue to be a thing, to make sure that those children can get a hot meal while they are at school. Then what has kind of happened, I think, from there is we've continued to put the holistic child first and foremost, front and center, which has both allowed and been encouraged by the reduction of other services for children. Because why have a separate children's services department that's going to make sure that they are fed, make sure that they are clothed, when the education department can do that? And so I think what we've kind of inadvertently created for ourselves by doing what is best for our young people is this situation where our young people have had their services reduced. Obviously, there are all kinds of more complicated factors than that. I am being super simplistic right now, and I'm not saying that schools need to stop looking out for the holistic well-being of our young people, because, making sure that they are okay, making sure that they are fed and clothed and alive is most important. But those things, making sure that our young people are okay, that is so important that it's wrong that it's kind of just left to schools, which are also trying to educate. It's wrong that there isn't a fully funded, completely separate department of children that oversees these things, that helps to pay for these things, that makes sure things are provided during the holidays for the children to do, that are not about school, that they can have a break from their school, they can have a break from their school building, they can have a break from those surroundings and do something different. Because it's no wonder children start to get a bit jaded and they start to get a bit tired of school if they are there all of the time, because it just so happens that that's also where their football club trains, and it just so happens that that's also where their holiday fun club runs, and it just so happens that that's also where their Sunday school operates from, out of the school hall, or more likely the other way around, and the school hires the village hall to do their PE lessons. And when we close our children's worlds down so that that school building is all that they have, and they begin to associate that school building with it being their entire life, it stands to reason that they see it less as a place of education and less of a place of academics, and let's be honest, more of a place that they can just be at home, because it is where they are spending a great deal of their time. Sorry, that was a rant that I didn't know that I would go off on this morning. I will say, as I always do, if you are listening live and you want to reply to anything that I am chatting about today, we are just talking about the historicity of schools and how things don't change, then please do text in. You can listen to me live via the Podbean app. You can, of course, listen to me live pretty much anywhere, but if you are listening via Podbean, then you can, of course, engage with everything that we are talking about today. So let's turn our attention then to John Milton. Now, if earlier in the week, let's say like Tuesday morning, you'd asked me about John Milton, I would have told you that he was a poet. because that's who he is to me. He's the author of Paradise Lost, this massive 12-volume blank verse poem, which was written to reflect and to kind of reinforce the religious and political upheaval that was happening at the time that it was written. I think it was like 1667, Paradise Lost dates back to. And kind of in my head, that's who he was. He was a poet. So when I found out that he had written this treatise on education, called annoyingly Of Education, I want to keep calling it On Education, but he clearly took a leaf out of Latin's book and he called it Of Education instead. I was quite surprised, and I was actually quite excited. You know, I am a literature person. I love literature. I do really like poetry. And so I was very excited that this person that I admire as a poet, whose work I admire, he clearly had some kind of background in education, because he felt compelled to write this treatise about the state of education in the 1600s. I was then very quickly disappointed to learn that he wasn't an educationalist at all. He was a poet. He was an intellectual, he was a civil servant, and he was a polemicist. In fact, I read a biography of him this week preparing for the show that listed polemicist among his professions, which I thought was quite funny. Polemicist, in case the word is new to you, because it's not a word that we use very much anymore, is somebody who deliberately antagonizes, particularly in political conversation, political discourse, kind of in order to get a rise. We've got quite a few of those these days, although they tend to write fewer treatises and more social media posts. Let's be honest. But again, you know, as in the theme of the show, nothing changes. In the 1640s, these polemicists were writing 8-page tracts on education, despite the fact that their only exposure to education was the fact that they'd gone to school. And these days, people are writing 280-character short-form microblogs on things. People don't change. Situations don't change. And that, it did lead me to wonder why he wrote on education. I wanted to know what kind of drove him to that. Why did he have an opinion? What made him think that he was in any way qualified to write about education? And the first thing that I came across was the fact that actually this treatise, and the reason that it's so short, only, you know, it's 8 pages long, which is relatively long. I have an audio recording actually of the whole thing that I was planning on playing for us at different points during the show today, but I don't actually think I'm going to have time because I went off on a bit of a rant. And the whole thing, the whole audiobook of education is only 30 minutes long. So, you know, it's not a particularly long tract, especially again when Paradise Lost spans 12 books. But it was actually written in response to the educational reformer Samuel Hartlib, who put out this call for opinions on education, because he wanted education to be reformed. Now, what's quite interesting about Hartlib is that he also wasn't a teacher. His profession, I've only done a kind of very brief look over his biography, so if we've got any Hartlib scholars in the audience who want to correct me, I am more than happy for that. But his profession was intelligencer, which, not going to lie, I love, and I kind of want to use that as my profession. I don't want to be called a teacher anymore. I want to be an intelligencer. But he basically, I'm sure he made this profession up, because if you asked Hartlib what he did for a living, he would often say that he furthered knowledge, which kind of does sound like a teacher, doesn't it? Or to me, that's what a teacher ought to be. But he himself, Hartlib, was a promoter and a writer in science, in medicine, in agriculture, in politics, in education. He was very much a polymath, as so many of these people were, and I think that is something that we forget these days. And I think it's something that I forget quite a lot when I think about non-educationalists espousing their opinions of education. We've become so obsessed these days with the concept of the specialist, despite the fact that, we're now in a post-truth, post-facts, post, what's the word? People who know what they're talking about era. We do still tend to idealize this idea of specialism, don't we? We heard it in Joe's news reports. The reason that these maths lessons are being farmed out is because there aren't enough specialist maths teachers. And so we do kind of lionize this idea of people who dedicate their whole educational experience to a subject, to a topic. And so it can be quite easy for us to forget that actually, again, if we go back in time, it wasn't the specialist who was lionized, but it was the generalist. And it was because, as I have said on the show before, you can be a generalist with deep knowledge. You can know lots of things about more than one topic. And that is something that we very often forget. In these days of wanting specialists, of wanting people to only know about one thing, kind of wanting people to stay in their lanes, I suppose, we forget that you can read books. You can go to the library and check out textbooks. You can go online and find the university course reading lists for things outside of your regular domain that interest you. I'm not a historian. I'm a linguist. At best, I could say that I'm a classicist, which kind of does give me a tiny little bit of historian training, but I'm not a historian. I know very little really about history once the Roman Empire stops being the Roman Empire. I always said when I was asked if I could teach the World War II unit of A-level French, that my knowledge of French history ends when Gaul stops being called Gaul. And so, I wasn't particularly qualified to teach that unit. I could just speak French. But I was able to go and check books out of the library and find things on JSTOR and Google Scholar and all of the other places that you go to find the articles. And I was able to educate myself because I had to, because that was what my young people needed me to do. So, it is viable for us all to have opinions on all topics, so long as you are educated within that topic. So long as, even if it's not your specialism, you've gone out and you've done the reading, just like I have done this week. I'm not a historian. I would never call myself a historian, but I've been able to go out and read about John Milton, to take the little bit of historical training that I do have in source analysis and all of that good stuff that we do in classics, and apply that to my further reading about this one particular historical figure. So that was kind of what qualified John Milton to have an opinion. Not just that he had been to school, although he had. He actually went all the way through and got himself a master's degree from Cambridge. So, he was very well educated. He spoke more languages than I do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. He spoke 11 languages. I've only got 9. So I need to pick up 3 more so that I can beat John Milton. He was a very well-educated person. And it was that education, that ability to go and read beyond the narrow specialism, read beyond what he had been taught in the classroom, not because what he had been taught in the classroom was wrong, but because what he had been taught in the classroom trained him to go and broaden his knowledge. That was kind of what gave him the ability to write on education as he did.
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Capel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to capelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads, no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
But there was also a bit of an arrogance to him that gave him the belief that he could and should write on this whole range of topics. Samuel Johnson, in the book Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets, said, "It appears in all his writings that he had the usual concomitant of great abilities, a lofty and steady confidence in himself, perhaps not without some contempt for others, for scarcely any man ever wrote so much and praised so few." So Milton clearly felt that he had something to say, that his ideas, his opinions were worth listening to. And for me, that's a really interesting idea. Now, I'm very much aware that I come to you on this platform every Saturday morning and I give you my thoughts and my opinions on whatever educational topic I've decided to talk about that week. And I think that I can do that because I'm a teacher, because I continue to be a practicing teacher. I have classes, I still teach, I research, I do all of that good stuff. But I'm not entirely sure how much I believe my opinion is worth listening to. Again, ironic, considering I come here every Saturday morning to talk to you. But I don't know. I do find the idea that somebody might listen to my opinion and agree with it, or listen to my opinion and change what they're doing as a result of it. I do find that really, really odd. And so I do find it quite difficult to get into the mindset of John Milton, thinking that people ought to listen to him. I mean, maybe that's not how he felt. Maybe he felt kind of like I do on a Saturday morning, where I just like talking about education and I'm not necessarily setting out to change somebody's mind or to influence their practice, but I like doing this reading, I like finding these things out, and I like sharing that with you. But for me, that's part of being a teacher. That's part of my brain that is a teacher. That kind of doesn't want to climb the career ladder because I'm aware that climbing the career ladder takes me out of the classroom. And first and foremost, what I want to do is share with my young people the stuff that I think is really interesting, that I think is really cool. That's also why I am so committed to the idea that schools should first and foremost be educational institutions, and that there ought to be other things available to young people to tick a lot of the boxes that we have to tick in schools, because I want more time to be able to share these interesting educational things with my young people. So, maybe that's how Milton felt. It's really difficult, isn't it, to ascribe motivations, to ascribe feelings to historical figures. But if we believe Samuel Johnson, Milton basically wrote on education, as in he wrote about education. He wrote of education, on education, because he felt that he could, because he felt that he should. And because there were a lot of these intelligencers at the time in the 15, 16, 1700s who kind of felt that their voice was worth listening to. And again, we see that these days. You, as my listeners, may be ascribing that that motivation to me. You might think that I have just lied to you, and that actually I do think my opinion is worth listening to, and that's why I'm here. And if you do think that, then more power to you, because all you have is my word that that's not why I'm here. Not that it would particularly matter either way, but we do see all over social media that there are people who do think that their opinion is worth listening to. Before social media, we used to see it on TV. You would have the Talking Heads programs where people would just pop up to spout their views on things, and it would always be the same people. And there would be jokes about how, they just came on because they were available. They had nothing else to do. So they were the ones that picked up the phone. But the fact that it was the same people over and over again suggests that there maybe is this group, a bit like John Milton, who do believe that their opinions are worth hearing. And for me, that can be a little bit uncomfortable, because despite everything that I've said about having the ability to read, about being able to go and research things, and formulate opinions that way, I do find it a little bit uncomfortable when non-teachers tell us how schools ought to be being run, and how when non-teachers tell us what we ought to be doing with the young people and what our priorities ought to be. I don't know why I feel that way. It's possible that I feel threatened in that way because, these people who don't spend 9 till 3 in the classroom and then have to do their research before and after, these people who can spend their whole day researching, they can find out more things than I can. They have the time, they have the platforms to do it. And so maybe there is part of me that is a little bit worried that these people will end up knowing more than I do, and so will be more qualified to speak than I do. I don't know. That's something about me that I need to unpack. But as I always say, I quite like shows where I start off thinking one thing. I start off with a very fixed mindset about something. But then as I talk to you, as we go through the show, I find my own mindset changing. And I say this to my kids as well. I think it's really important as a teacher to be open to new ideas, to be open to new things, new ways of doing something. Because if we just do it the way it's always been done, then nothing is ever going to change. In fact, a very, very good friend of mine sent me a text yesterday. Was it yesterday? I don't remember. I think it was yesterday. With that exact quote on it, the most dangerous phrase in language is, "We've always done it this way." And that was Grace Hopper, apparently, who was a pioneer in computer programming. So yeah, I do think it's important to have this kind of open mindset, to be flexible, to be willing to change your mind. Although maybe not when you are live on Podbean attempting to educate people about something. All right, so now that we've established that most people saw Milton as this kind of little bit arrogant talking head character, let's zoom in on Of Education. So, published in 1644, it was this treatise that actually appeared anonymously, which I find really interesting. Milton, in the first instance, didn't want his name attached to it. So he wasn't using this to try and further his career. He wasn't using this as his own attempt to break into educational discourse. He very clearly just believed in what he was talking about. And these days we say, oh, if you feel so strongly about what you're saying, you should put your name on it. One of the reasons that the kind of old school fora are getting bad reps in the news at the moment is because they encourage anonymity. They encourage you to use a pseudonym instead. I remember the days of being told never use your real name on the internet. And just in 30 years, that has now changed so that you are suspicious if you don't use your real name on the internet. But yeah, he published this treatise as a letter written in response to Samuel Hartlib. And in it, it gives a really comprehensive statement on what he thought educational reform should look like. And he describes it as concerning the best and noblest way of education. And again, it can be really hard as a linguist to read that and go, is he being arrogant? Is he saying that his opinion of education is the best and noblest? Or is this just how they wrote? Did they just have this very fancy, this very kind of verge of arrogance way of writing? Again, we will never know. We will never know. But in it, Milton argued for a dual objective of education. He wanted education to prepare young people for public life. He said that education should fit a man to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of peace and war. So essentially, he was arguing that education should prepare children for adult life. Essentially, he was arguing for employability. Ironically, given it in the past 5-10 years, that has been the very obvious shift that we have seen. I mentioned this in a show that I did not too long ago. How you go onto a university webpage and the first thing they will tell you is how many of their graduates go straight into work. Most degree courses will tell you what employability skills their course offers you. When it's year 9 options evening, again, I've said this exact thing not too long ago, when it's year 9 options evening, one of the things that we will tell parents is this is how a GCSE in French can benefit your child in the world of work. And so this idea, even though it looks new, it's not new, it's just repackaged. We've just taken this language of all the offices, both private and public, of peace and war, and we've condensed that down into employability. So that was the first thing that Milton said education should do. The second is more private. And it's very religious. I mean, bearing in mind that this was published in 1644. This is during a lot of the religious upheaval that was coming off of the back of I don't know whether history teachers still talk about it, but how I was taught in year 8, the religious roller coaster of the Tudor period, where you were going from Catholicism to Protestantism depending on who was on the throne. So we got all of that going on, and there was this attempt to kind of stabilize society through religious discourse. And so Milton said this second point of education was to repair the ruins of our first parents, so Adam and Eve, by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to be like him, and we may the nearest by possessing our soul of true virtue. Now, if you were to strip away all of the religious language from that, keeping in mind that the vast majority of educational establishments these days are secular by nature, even if not by name, what Milton is saying is that schools should prepare our children to be good people. That's actually what he's saying there, repair the ruins of our first parents. So that's overcoming that Christian concept of original sin, overcoming the kind of worst parts of yourselves, and then to love him, to be like him. So Christians will try to emulate God, will try to emulate Jesus, the Messiah, by being the best versions of themselves that they can be. And I think if you were to ask most people, not even most teachers, but most people, what are the points of going to school, they will say employability and to be a good person. So nothing has changed. In terms of what is the point of going to school, nothing really has changed since 1644. Should it change? Should we change our perception of what schools are for, is the question. And it's the question that has no very clear answer. I am not sure whether employability should be the goal, because I feel like a focus on employability, particularly in very stark terms as we use it now, when we define it as employability, I feel like that reduces education. I feel like it takes away the joy of education, the joy of learning, the fun of finding out new things. I also think it opens up justification to narrow pathways down. And we've seen that happening sort of in sixth form. We've seen the number of A levels that pupils take shrink and shrink and shrink. When I was in sixth form, we started doing 5 and then reduced down to 4. Whereas these days, most schools will have their pupils start with 4 A levels and then reduce down to 3, and then maybe do an extended project qualification on the side. And again, the reason for that is that education is ostensibly more difficult. A levels are hard. We want our children to be able to focus, to be able to give their all to the topics that they've chosen, to the subjects that they've chosen. The subjects that they've chosen are most likely going to relate to what they're going to end up doing at university, and what they do at university is most likely going to relate to what they want to do as a job. And so again, like many things we've talked about this morning, it's that kind of cyclical nature of employability is important, therefore let's reduce the number of things that we get our young people to do so that they can focus, so that they can be employable. But then by reducing that number of things that they are doing, they are making themselves focus on employability because they know they only have 3 options, so they've got to pick the 3 that are most related to the field that they want to go in. And again, it reduces this idea that we can learn because learning is interesting. it reduces this idea that you can learn something completely different just because you want to. And, I'll acknowledge my bias here, but we see this in languages. I've had so many sixth formers tell me that they would love to carry on with a language post GCSE, but they don't need it for their career. I would argue that, but that's by the by. And so they're not going to do it for A-level. And I've done whole courses and whole conferences about how, there are alternatives. So I'm not going to talk about that here, but that's what we're seeing. When I had Luke on the show a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the value of arts and whether we truly value arts within education, a lot of young people were saying, we talked about this on this show, that they don't perceive that the arts factor into their career plans, factor into their employability, and so they don't study them even though they would like to. And so what we're doing, again, is we're creating this kind of, or we're perpetuating this idea of specialism, and we are creating these specialists, but our specialists don't situate themselves in anything. A lot of people, when I talk about the number of languages that I speak, will ask me how. After they ask me why, they'll ask me how. And it's because, as any language teacher will tell you, when you've learnt one, it makes learning another easier. But then I also found that when doing my classics degree. I had language training, and so I picked up Latin and Greek very, very quickly. But then by learning those languages, I was able to pick up the history parts very, very quickly, because parts of the history made sense to me based on what I knew of the language and the language progression of the time. And so even these two seemingly quite disparate ideas fed into each other, and they made me a better linguist, and being a linguist made me a better classicist, even though most people might tell you that they are two completely separate things. I always make sure when I teach GCSE Latin that I do the unit on culture. It's called literature and culture. It's called because you can't understand the language if you don't understand the people that spoke it. And I think we do quite often forget to situate our knowledge in the wider world, in the broader domains, because we are so focused on this idea of specializing. And we actually become less specialized for it, because we don't always understand how our specialization sits comfortably within everything else that exists. So, should education change? I think yes. I think, employability is important. I recognize that our young people have to go out and get jobs. I recognize that we all need money to live. We live in a capitalist society, that you're not disputing that. What I am saying is that in this world where everything is moving so quickly, and where one of the things that we like to talk about as a virtue of schooling is that our young people will have jobs that don't even exist yet, how can we really give a guarantee of employability to anything? Because we don't know what jobs these people are going to go into. People are talking about AI in terms of, young people should learn this because they will go into jobs that are fed by AI. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, given how quickly large language models have evolved over the past few years, how do we know that any training in large language models that we give them now is going to be useful? So I think that it does need to be a bit less about overt employability. You need to learn this skill because it will feed into this job, and more about the joy of learning, the joy of education, the joy of being educated, to make your employability better because you are proving that you can keep up with advances. You are proving that you can go out to the library and check out a book and read it and understand it and learn from it. So that's one way that I think that that education should change. So Milton, in writing, he was kind of talking about how they needed to move on from medieval education because they were still operating very much in a medieval educational style. And medieval education was overtly religious. There's no ignoring that. It was primarily concerned with this idea of uncovering truth that would lead the young person back to God through moral righteousness. But interestingly, what that did was it presented children with concepts that they weren't ready for. So long before Vygotsky was talking about zones of proximal development and about how, you build on one, you start with the very basics and then you build on that, Milton was actually arguing for the same thing. Milton was saying that the educational system as it was still operating in the 1640s was doing too much too soon, and that they needed to break everything right down. That there is very little point talking to a 6-year-old about the transcendental truth of God because they won't understand what that means. And if they're not going to understand it, what's the point of talking about it? And this is one of the reasons that education shouldn't change. Because that I think is absolutely correct, that you need to build on a foundation. That you shouldn't just jump straight in with complicated stuff. And I think for me, that is something that has come from experience. I remember starting my teaching career thinking, well, I could teach my year 7s some of these really complex, GCSE French phrases, because why not? They can just learn it as a phrase and they can use it and it will be great. But it wasn't great because they weren't ready. They didn't know how to deploy those phrases effectively. And it ended up being a bit of a mess. I'm quite happy to admit that. And so I learned from it. I learned very quickly. I was able to backtrack and I was able to make sure that then I started teaching my year 7s the basics, the fundamentals that they needed so that they then could deploy those more complex phrases. But that's, Milton's truth, that you can introduce some things too soon, is my truth, and is something that I encountered. So that's a way that it doesn't change. But what is quite interesting, I think, is this kind of idea that is common sense. Of course, you introduce the basics before you introduce things that are more complicated. Why wouldn't you? Of course, a child needs to know that 2 + 2 is 4 before they can solve quadratic equations, because in their quadratic equation, they might need to add 2 and 2 together. But the only reason that is common sense is because we had educational reformers like Milton looking at the way education was operating and going, actually, hold on a minute, this isn't working. These children are not understanding these concepts. This is too complicated. And this is another reason why I think it's really important for us as teachers to understand and to know about the historicity of our career, because so much of what we take for granted as just being the way it is isn't some kind of magical natural order. We don't find schools in nature. If we're going for a Thomas Aquinas, we've got to look to nature to see how things ought to be. Educational systems that we have don't exist. So they've come from somewhere. And so if something isn't working, we don't just say, or we shouldn't just say, oh, that's just how schools are, and put up with it. We can look back at where these things that aren't working started, find out why they were implemented in the first place, figure out whether that reason for implementation still exists in the modern world. If it doesn't, change it. And if it does, look at where it's gone wrong. So again, in our society, in schools that are broadly secular, we don't really worry about preparing our children to understand the true nature of God. Some schools do, I acknowledge that, but the vast majority don't. But we do want them to come out of it being good people. And so, maybe we have looked at some point along history, we have looked at what it is to be somebody who follows God, and we have seen that that broadly aligns with what society thinks a good person is, and so we're doing the same things, but we're just shifting them slightly. Why did that punishment book exist? Why were those boys in St. Mary's C of E primary school being punished? And a lot of people will say that punishment is corrective, that punishment exists to help people understand how to act, how to behave within society.
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Capel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to capelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads, no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
The other thing that Milton kind of really underlines of education is how much time is being wasted. So the medieval curriculum focused on what was called the trivium. So the study of grammar, of rhetoric, and of dialectics. And that was, again, right from when children started school at the age of 6, 7, 8 years old. And explicit grammar instruction dominated the very first few years of a student's education. And it was a purely linguistic focus. So the children aimed at perfecting prose, at perfecting writing in a style that was kind of not really rooted in anything other than this is how you should write. Not gonna lie, as a linguist, I quite like that idea. I quite like the idea that we should learn how to express ourselves properly. But that was all they did for the first few years. And of course, they did it not just in English, but in Latin and Greek as well. And what was weird about that was that the Latin and Greek that they were producing didn't really reflect the ways that the Romans wrote in. And there was a lot of critique of that at the time, that they were essentially writing English, but with Latin and Greek words. And, whether or not in ancient languages we should be striving to replicate how the ancients wrote, that's a whole thing that we're not going to talk about today. But Milton essentially said, you can do everything that these young people are doing in their first few years of education within 1 year, because of how much time is wasted doing the same thing over and over and over again. And he said that if you were to do that, you could expand the curriculum beyond the trivium, beyond these three things, and then beyond the quadrivium, which is what they graduated into. And that was looking at arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So the idea being that when you had mastered language by going through the trivium, you could then move into maths and science, into the quadrivium. And Milton said, if we actually just spent less time doing the same things over and over and over again, we could A, do more, and B, we could get them to actually enjoy what they are doing. He wrote that after children are taught foundational grammar, they should be won early to the love of virtue. I quite like that phrase. So once they've kind of understood the basics, the priority should be getting them to enjoy learning, to understand that learning kind of improves them as people, and to want them to do that. And he said that they should have some easy and delightful book of education. So Milton actually was one of the first people to really advocate for textbooks, which is ironic given that we are kind of moving away from textbook-based education these days. Booklets are becoming more popular. Online learning strategies, even within brick and mortar schools, are becoming more popular. But Milton was really, really arguing for this idea that they should have a textbook. And I really love that phrase, easy and delightful. Because I think delight is something that, again, we don't think about in education very often. We don't look at a textbook and go, oh, that's delightful. That's going to be the one that I'm going to buy. We look at the textbook and we see whether it's rigorous. We see whether it offers everything that our curriculum needs it to offer. We see whether it's going to save us some time, not having to come up with exercises of our own. But I actually agree with Milton that if we use books that are not necessarily easy, because we know that children don't like things to be too easy, we know that they like a challenge, but we also don't want them to be too hard. But if they are, let's say, adequately challenging and delightful, that might be something, again, that really can encourage that love of learning, that desire to learn for learning's sake. So he spends quite a lot of time talking about grammar, because of course that was a big part of education back at the time. And then he moves on to curriculum sequencing. And again, this is where he talks about how you should start with the basics and build on top of that instead of starting with what is most difficult. He talks about art. He explains that art needs to be within the curriculum. And unsurprisingly, given that he is a poet, he talks about poetry and the place of poetry. So he believes that a curriculum should include grammar, arithmetic, geometry, religion, agriculture, geography, astronomy, physics, trigonometry, ethics, economics, languages, politics, law, theology, church history, poetry, rhetoric, and logic. So Milton was really arguing for a broad curriculum. Now, a lot of these things, in fact, the vast majority of those things we do still teach. We just call them something different. Arithmetic, geometry, trigonometry are all bundled under the subheading maths. Religion, theology, church history are all bundled under religious studies. Grammar, rhetoric, logic are all bundled under English. So we do still teach Milton's broad curriculum, but we kind of don't make it as explicit as Milton seemed to want it to be. We don't make it as separate as Milton wanted to be, which I think is to do with the amount of time that is spent in schools. Now, keeping in mind that Milton was conducting a thought experiment, essentially. He was saying, if we spend less time having the kids do the same things over and over again, we'll be able to fit all of this in. So he wasn't saying that that was possible. He was saying that it was, or he wasn't saying that it was likely. He was saying that it was possible. He was saying this is something that we could do. But isn't that an argument that we've all had? If we remove this from the curriculum, we've got more time for this. Isn't that an argument we've heard governments making? If we remove arts from the curriculum, we've got more time for maths and English. And it's always, we will have more time for maths and English. So the big question that I came to this week with was, do things ever change? And my answer is no. We've gone back to 1644 with Milton, and we've gone back to the 1600s as well with St Mary's C of E Primary School. And we've seen that things don't change. We've seen that we have the same conversations, the same arguments over and over again. Because apparently it's true that if we don't learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it. And we don't learn from our own professional history very much. I kind of had no real interest in educational history beyond sort of how it kind of fitted into other things that I was interested in. I understand how the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians went to school because I'm interested in their cultures. I understand how the ancient Chinese were educated because I'm interested in that culture. But I never thought about how my own practice, my own professionalism is situated in the context of British educational history until this week, if I'm very, very honest. But now I've realized the importance of it. I've realized why it's good for us to know where we come from, what the history of education is, and I'm going to carry on investigating it, I think. I've run overtime today. And I apologize for that, particularly if you were waiting for me to finish so that you can go and listen to Michael with his show. I hope that you have found my kind of exploration of the history of British schooling through the lens of John Milton as interesting as I found researching it. I'm going to keep going with this research because I think it is really interesting, and I encourage all of you to do the same. Thank you all very much for listening. I do appreciate it. I hope you all have a great week. I will see you next Saturday. Thank you very much and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.